All right. Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Parker. As we teach Dr. Parker how to do an online class, which is not something I've done before, uh, I was sort of debating with myself the best way to respond to the discussion, and the debate was sort of between should I do it in writing in the way that you all have done, which I think has its advantages, and it would be down there permanently and things like that. But what I'm going to try this time, and I need you to tell me which you prefer, is to go through to make a screencast and go through here visually and go through the different conversations and then just sort of talk about them because I feel that I will say more than I would write because I am lazy and because I'm a human and uh, my best mode of operation as a teacher is to kind of speak off the cuff. So we're going to try that, but please, please, please let me know if this is not satisfactory to you, if this is something that doesn't sit well with you for whatever reason, if this is something, if you have trouble following them because I scroll the screen around and that makes you feel dizzy. And I'll try not to do a lot of that, by the way. So this week we're working on the book of the Duchess, which you all did a great job with your questions. And I enjoyed your discussion very much, and you brought up things that I'd not thought about this book. So I'm going to go through here, I guess, in reverse order because chronologically they start down here with Sarah, and I'm going to go through Sarah's comments and the responses and throw in my 2 cents, which is probably about what it's worth. Okay, so the first question is about chess as a metaphor. And Sarah writes, the man in black likens the role of the queen in his life to the role of a queen on a chessboard. She served as a source of protection and retreat for him when she was alive. And now that she's dead, he cannot fathom how he will go on without her. The loss of a queen in a chess game can be fatal to the safety and triumph of the king. And that's really smart. I hadn't thought of it in exactly that way. That, in the story of a king and queen, the queen is the wife and the source of love and motherhood and things like that. But the idea of the queen as protector makes sense in the context of the chess game. And I think not as in real life, not as a physical protector against harm, but as a source of emotional and spiritual protection. I think probably so. So I like that. I like that reading of this metaphor. And like I say, it was not something I'd thought about. Seix and Halcyon, Seix and Halcyon, there's all different spellings for these figures, are famed for their love. Their story is beautiful and heartbreaking. Halcyon takes slight comfort in being able to prepare her husband's body for the funeral, but afterwards she finds she cannot bear to live with him. It seems a bit odd because in Seix and Halcyon, it's the death of the husband, and in the Book of the Duchess, it's obviously the death of the wife. Yeah, it's interesting because they are both stories of the death of spouses, but they're different. I mean, there's no indication that the man in black didn't know that his wife was dead. Rather, he did. He was probably there. This was during the plague, which is what at least the historical Duchess Blanche died of. But and we'll get several of you comment on this that. Halcyon's problem seems to be more with the uncertainty, at least at first, than it is with the actual fact of the death. And I think this is interesting because it's true. If somebody goes missing, the family just wants resolution first, and then they can deal with the process of grieving. But it is not what happened to the man in black. So I'm not sure how that happened. Now, in the storyline, of course, what happens is this is the story that the narrator was reading when he fell asleep and this vision came to him. So I guess it doesn't have to follow a conventional logic, but rather a dream logic. But yeah, I've never made complete sense out of why that particular myth is used. Speaking of courtly love, and this will come up a lot, this subject of courtly love, and I think you've mostly caught on that courtly love is the kind of love that you expect people in the court, in the king's court, to have. That's at least the way that the medievals would understand it. The same thing with chivalry. Chivalry just comes from the word for horse, the French cheval, Spanish caballo, and it is the kind of love that was practiced between the class of soldier that rode the horse, which is to say the knights. If you were a wealthy person, you were a knight, and you were in the cheval, you were in the horse corps. If you were a poor person, you were on foot. So chivalry, so now when we say this fella opened the door for his date, that chivalry, that goes way back to this sort of belief in 12th century France that knights ought to behave in a certain way towards ladies. And it's kind of a sudden thing. It just happened, comes out of nowhere in the 12th century in French literature, the idea that men put women on a pedestal, whereas up to this point in history, up to 1100 to 1150, women had been second-class citizens, and of course they continue to be second-class citizens, but they were at least paid sort of lip service as being objects of veneration. And of course, courtly love has got extremely serious issues with it too that we'll talk about in this work and in other works. Number 4, the fluidity of the poem is dreamlike. Right, he can be in bed, and then his bedroom turns into a cathedral, then the cathedral turns into a forest. Right, that's one of the things. And we're not really allowed to question why this, why that. Just as in a dream, you can't really explain why you're in your elementary school, but you're in a bathing suit, but you have to take a telegram to the president all at the same time. It's just true. It's just a given in the world of the dream. So Chaucer really exploits that so he can kind of do what he wants without having to provide a continuity in the common sense way. Number 5, does this seem like a modern portrayal of the grieving process? And I'm really interested in the way that you all respond to this, because one of the things that I want to think about in this course is in what ways is Chaucer like a modern? Does he think the way that we think? Does he approach things the way that we approach them emotionally and spiritually and psychologically and everything else? And in what ways is he different? And Chaucer is very often cited as being one of the first people, or one of the first authors, to really explore the idea of character. That's what one of the reasons that Chaucer remains popular is that his stories are character driven, whereas a lot of medieval authors were more interested in allegory, or they were more interested in some kind of moral teaching, whereas Chaucer focuses on the individual, and we moderns are very fixated on the individual. So I was interested in your response to this. Sarah has said, it does feel like a modern portrayal of the grieving process in the way that the Man in Black reminisces. He relives many of their moments together as he expresses his love. However, it does not feel modern in the way the Man in Black has no hope for his life after his wife's death. He finds he has no will to live any longer. And it's true at the end, where the poem closes, the knight does not necessarily seem to have moved forward, the Man in Black. But on the other hand, what we know, and what I'm pretty sure Chaucer's audience would have known, is this is meant to be John of Gaunt. And he didn't die of his love. He didn't die of a broken heart like Halcyon did. He did move on. And I think that maybe what we're meant to see is kind of a snapshot in time that, no, he doesn't sort of smile and say, you're right, life is worth living, and whistle a happy tune. On the other hand, I think that the experience of telling this story to the narrator, telling about his grief, is maybe the first step into kind of acknowledging it and verbalizing it, and in that way maybe moving forward. So yeah, I don't know. I do see a modern grieving process in here, but I also see a very different process than I think most people now would go through. Callie's responded to Sarah here. The Chaucer narrator, who is such a dope, because the knight is using a metaphor. He says, I've lost my queen in my game of chess with fortune. And Chaucer is such a dense idiot that he thinks that the guy is crying over an actual chess game. And that's pretty dopey on his part. But I think it was for one thing, it's supposed to be a little bit funny. It's supposed to be a tiny bit of comic relief in this fairly dark poem. But I think also what we're supposed to see is this gives the man in black an opportunity, albeit frustrating, to really verbalize his grief. That if he's been using this metaphor in his head mentally to deal with it, I guess that's fine on one level, but he hasn't. He needs to say the words, "She is dead." He needs to make it to stop using sort of metaphors and putting it at a remove from himself, but rather he needs to say it in factual terms and not allegorical terms. The story of Seius and Alcyone, right? It is an interesting choice to lead into his dream. I agree. And Callie writes here, he falls asleep reading the story of a woman who has lost her love, needs to be convinced of it, and then ultimately dies of heartbreak when convinced. And right, and then you go on to say, this is interesting as we think of the man in black who is clearly grieving, needs some convincing of his loss. And I think you're really onto something here, and I think maybe this is the key to why that story is that she needs to know, is my husband really dead? And even though, as you say, the man in black does know it, he knows it, but does he know it? I mean, he knows it intellectually, but has he come to any kind of grip with it emotionally? And I'm not sure that he has until the end of the poem. So I think that there is a very real sense in which you may be on to why did Chaucer choose that particular story. Courtly love, I guess this little smile is supposed to be this little J is supposed to be a winky smile that says that we men are not chivalric, which is probably somewhat true in some ways and somewhat not true. You're right. No, we certainly give value to the description of the object of one's affection, but not in this kind of detail. Certainly, we don't do the affectio and the notatio, and I'll have to go back and look up the lines, but this is a really classic courtly love way to describe a lady. Is first you make a head-to-toe catalog of her looks, and it's hair, which is like gold, and skin, which is like ivory, and eyes, which are gray. The medieval ideal of beauty was very, very much very pale, very blonde, not tan. Body type could vary a little bit, although just basically sort of a youthful and soft body type. In some ways that stereotype still survives, but it's interesting. And what I think that you'll find here and elsewhere is that the ideal womanly form in the Middle Ages is the way it is always, which is that it tends to be linked to money. That if you were a wealthy person, number one, you might be very pale because you didn't have to work outside in the fields for your sustenance. And number two, you might not be the skinniest thing out there because you have enough food to eat. And so in the Middle Ages, this sort of very, and the Renaissance, this very sort of pale, and what I think we would all consider to be very normal, but sort of a size 12 to 14 to 16 would be considered ideal, because here's someone who is wealthy. They have the luxury of staying inside, and they have the luxury of having enough food to eat. Some things have changed now, because now if somebody's very, very pale, it may mean that they have to work because a lot of our work is inside. So they're working at, Walmart or a factory floor or whatever, and they don't get the leisure to go and tan. Whereas wealthy women might have that opportunity to go on vacations or to go to a tanning bed. And by the same token, body shape, at least in the Western world, we're blessed and fortunate that even poor people, and in fact, some ways, especially poor people, can be overweight because the food that's the most available and the cheapest also is the most fattening. It's not particularly healthy. So whereas a poor woman might be eating sort of more junky food now, a wealthy woman might have the money to buy fish or maybe even have a chef or to eat at healthy places, and also to have a gym membership or a personal trainer or things like that. So, um, one thing that's a fairly constant in the Western world is if you look at what the ideal look for a woman is, it's going to tend to be linked to whatever a rich woman would look like, which is interesting and discouraging, I think, both. Right, so the affictio, the head to toe description. Then there's the notatio, and this is a description of moral qualities. And you're right, even though we go to the romantic comedy and we're supposed to pick up on all of, she's a swell girl and she's just one of the guys and all these things that we're supposed to admire in a woman now. Um, but the idea of having it sort of listed off, or the idea that a guy would go and describe his new girlfriend to his friends, here's what she looks like, but let me give you a catalog of her moral virtues. It would be great if everybody did that, but maybe we don't see that as often. Also, though, we have to keep in mind this idea of courtly love. It was a literary commonplace for sure. I don't know whether it was actually practiced, though. You have to remember what we're reading is an idealized version of something that, this is the Nicholas Sparks novel of the 14th century. So, do all guys act like guys in Nicholas Sparks novels? Well, no, they don't. And did all knights act like characters in the Book of the Duchess? Probably not. And I don't know if any of them did. We just know that it was a literary convention. So, having said all of that, I do think there is a notion of chivalry, even if it's not practiced that much, that kind of continues to hang around our civilization, at least in the Western world. And there's still a little bit, and we can have the debate later about whether or not it is this way of looking at a woman completely desirable. Because on the one hand, certainly it's respectful and venerating of the woman, but it's still making her other. If you treat a woman as a marginalized second-class citizen, that's keeping her from a one-on-one relationship with you. But if you treat her as an object to be worshipped, almost like a goddess, that's also putting her outside of your own circle and your own sort of notions of what a peer would be. So I think it's still problematic, but it's probably better than the alternative. Callie, that's right. This is Callie's post that was meant to be a post somewhere else, but I'm going to continue on with it. What are some crazy things that happen in this dream vision? Sure, all of the stuff, the stumbling on the hunt, the connections of the story he was reading as he was falling asleep to the story that he creates in his dream. Right, and I think a couple of you pointed out, yes, sometimes if you fall asleep watching a certain show, or you fall asleep reading a certain book, that then might figure into your dream. And I also like the way you point out that this is the moment that's appropriate for the dream to end, because it is the end of a moment. I mean, we don't know what happens to the man in black, but is in sort of a story arc way, this is the right place to end it. And that's interesting because when we look at our next poem, The House of Fame, there's a lot of debate as to whether that poem was unfinished or whether it was deliberately left to look unfinished, as very different than this one, which has got a very conclusive kind of ending that you see here. Yes, in number 5, Callie has said this does seem like a modern form of grieving, that the stages of grief, which I think a lot of you point out, sort of bargaining, acceptance, anger, etc., that he seems to be going through some of these. Which would make Chaucer a pretty early psychologist. And what a lot of people like about Chaucer is that he does seem to be psychologically pretty right on with a lot of things. Right, and a couple of responses about chess. So really we've seen Sarah's response and Callie's response, which is great. So I'm going to go back to the board here. Back to the Book of the Duchess response. I hope this is okay. I hope you are not finding this to be terribly tedious. I'm enjoying it. I like it. I like reading your responses. You may be tired of listening to my voice. Right, so we've seen Callie's response, and then the response to the response. Yeah, and this is Julie's response, and this is where you're right. The chivalric and courtly love was not necessarily something that you were familiar with as a term, although clearly you're familiar with the concept. And yeah, it's the knight in shining armor. It's the damsel in distress, and but down here you went so far as to look up the definition of courtly love, and you've dug up something that, while it doesn't apply here, actually is a feature of it, which is that you looked at Grolier's and it says romantic love or romantic devotion for a sexually unattainable woman, usually another man's wife. And then you look somewhere else at David Simpson's article, um, and adulteress is one of the things about it. Yeah, this is true. In stories, especially the stories of Marie de France from the 12th century, very often the situation is you have this beautiful, very young woman, and she is married against her will to an old, wealthy man who is normally, just for them, 60 was kind of the cutoff point. That was an old man, and given life expectancy, that would be fairly old. So, and then the old man is jealous and protective of her, keeps her locked up in a tower or something like that, and then a knight finds her somehow, sees her through the window, and works for 10 years to achieve her release, or to break in and visit her. And then they take up an affair which may or may not be sexually consummated. It definitely was in some cases, but seems not to have been in others. And right, so the moral issue of this makes a really interesting for an interesting problem, because on the one hand, yes, these women in many cases are married, and these relationships are adulterous, and they just are. And nobody, the knight is not deceived; he knows that she's married. But on the other hand, there seems to be kind of a moral squishiness in there, in that their husbands are inappropriate partners for them. They're old, they're not loving, and there's very often an implication that they are sexually not able to perform because of their age. So there might be a little wiggle room with the idea that these are marriages, but maybe they're not consummated, so they're not 100% valid marriages. So I don't know, but it's interesting. I mean, the church did not like courtly romances. The church did not like courtly love stories, partly because of the aspect of adultery, but also going back to something that we said a little bit earlier, which was because the women in them were treated almost as objects of worship. That these were, the stories were almost idolatrous. That the heroes, the knights, treated these women with a sort of veneration that really is only owing to either a person of the Trinity, or maybe a saint in Catholic theology, but not a flawed human, sinful woman. So yeah, you invoke Harlequin romance, and I think you're not very far wrong. So one of the interesting things, though, that Chaucer is doing is he's taking some of these courtly love conventions, but he's applying them to a marriage which was not based on an adulterous courtship, a marriage that was brokered in the most acceptable possible way, to a couple that was loving. The other aspect of courtly love that's alluded to is that she keeps him waiting for a year to prove himself, to prove his constancy. And while to us that might seem kind of mean, to keep your fellow waiting for a year, I mean, if she is in fact in love, but that the year was the standard period, and that was supposed to illustrate both his constancy and his ability to sort of stick with it, but also her chastity, the idea that she is of a pure enough mind and free enough of lust that she's not rushing into anything, that she finds it more important to have him prove his moral worth than to rush into something. So good. This is all interesting stuff. So I'm going to click back over to the discussion board. So now we've heard from Sarah and Callie. Now we'll click up Becca's response here. By the way, congratulations to everybody on surviving the great internet scare of 2015. The undergraduates on campus were just going nuts. They thought they were going to die without Netflix, I think was the main thing. And I'm sorry I couldn't get in touch with you all because of the way that the email was, but everybody seems to have taken it in stride and then just posted when you could post, and you did that quickly. So thanks for that. You did a great job with that. All right, so Becca, first, and these will start to overlap, of course, because y'all were all answering the same questions. But here, Becca said chess is a metaphor for life, more specifically, the fact that Man in Black's wife has died. He says Fortune, who is personified as a woman, has played a game with false moves until she took his queen. He laments that he should have played better and guarded his queen more closely. And Becca's brought up a couple of things that are new, and they're both really astute, and I want to talk about them. Number one, the fact that Fortune is personified as a woman. This is a really, really common theme in medieval literature, which is the image of Fortuna, the Latin word for fortune, which is a feminine noun, and she is personified as a woman. Also, fortune is linked to the moon in the idea that the moon is always changing. The moon never stays constant. And in the same way, fortune is always changing. Your luck never holds. If you've been right, one of the big images in medieval art was the Wheel of Fortune, which looked like almost like a Ferris wheel, and at the top would be someone who was like a king. On the side going up would be young men who were sort of working their way up in the world. And then on the way down, you have the king. Once you get to the top, there's nowhere to go but down. And so you would have the king or whoever falling off of the wheel into a pit of snakes or something awful like that. So you're right to pick up on the fact that Fortune is personified as a woman, and I think all of whatever bad stereotypes you want to put in there, that women are fickle, that women are changing, that women are inconstant, which you will discover the world of Chaucer, not necessarily Chaucer himself, but just that world was full of misogyny and just absolutely had lamentable attitudes about women. Chaucer actually ends up being pretty good about women, because he does have some false and deceptive women, but he has some pretty strong women too in his writing. Number one, fortune as the woman, fortune is the moon, and you're right that he talks about the fact that fortune sort of cheated. She used tricks. I don't know. Cheating would be one way of looking at it. Moves, sort of dishonorable moves. Maybe this move is legal, but it was kind of like a sneaky one. But of course, the thing is that, and maybe I think something that Chaucer's getting at a little bit, is that it is changeable. You can lose somebody in the blink of an eye. And as I said, in London, during the plague, something like 50% of the population died, and it was not particularly kind to young people or anything like that. You had no better chance of survival being young and healthy than you did being, if you were old and infirm, I guess it was worse, but age was not a factor. Class was not a determining factor for the most part with this. So you're right. To him, of course, he's right. It seems unfair and it seems like cheating. On the other hand, it's fortune. Everything is fortune. Everything is the luck of the dice to some extent. So he says he should have played better. He should have guarded his queen better. But not, there's not really anything he could do. But I think that, as y'all have mentioned, that one of the stages of grief is the sort of self-blaming, the sort of guilt. What could I have done differently? We know that probably he could have done nothing differently. But it is his, and the very idea that he puts it down to fortune, and the alternatives to fortune, he could have said it was a medical issue, which is one thing that's true. It was that she just got sick. And of course, the other thing is that doesn't really get mentioned in here, which is interesting to me, is the idea of some kind of providence, of some kind of divine, it was her time, God called her home sort of a message, which he doesn't seem to be interested in. And I don't know why. I think in other places in Chaucer, you will see that. You will see an idea of a death or something that seems to be unfortunate as actually being part of a divine plan, but not here. So I think this idea that when someone dies in such an unexpected way, and it seems so unfair, you want to blame somebody or something. And in his case, he's personifying fortune, blaming her, saying she cheated. It's not fair. Well, he's right. It's not fair, but it's not unusual either. Um, Number two, Sais and Alcyone. Yeah, once again, Alcyone's grieving seems to be based on her not knowing more so than his death. Although once the death is confirmed, she dies of a broken heart, and she is not a suicide. She doesn't actively bring about her death, but she just sort of lets her heart break. She just allows herself to be carried off into the darkness. And again, this couple is a ancient Greek couple, so they're not necessarily looking for a reunion in heaven. They're looking maybe to a shadowy life in the underworld of Pluto, maybe at best. Number three, courtly love is still around. Girls complain there are no worthwhile guys around because they lack gentlemanly manners. Every time somebody wonders, yeah, what are the rules? It's so hard to know what the rules are, right? Am I supposed to open the door for you? Well, some women might be offended if you open the door for them. Some of them might be offended if you don't. What's a fella to do? And what a fella is to do is to just have common sense and consideration and be a nice guy. But we can claim at least that it's confusing a little bit. So that, yeah, we do have this sort of image of courtly love, and in some ways it's more difficult in that the rules are more changing. Chaucer didn't have to deal with when, after you get back from your date, when is it appropriate to text, right? At what point in a relationship do you exchange numbers, right? Things like that. So, but we do still hold on to this sort of idea, and we're sort of a dual personality culture because we want to advance equality and have men and women be peers in some things, but then when it comes to romantic personal relationships, that whole thing gets iffy and shifty. I think I'm an old guy. You guys probably already know much more than I do and know what you're doing. Number four, yes, there were some strange things going on. And yeah, you pointed out the man in black seems to be just kind of hanging. He's just sitting under a tree. He's not part of the hunt. It doesn't seem like, although he maybe ostensibly was. And it does almost seem like he was waiting for someone to tell the story. And I think maybe in an emotional sense that was true, even if he didn't know he was waiting for someone to tell his story. Perhaps he was. He needed to tell it. He needed it to be verbalized so that it could be real. Number five, I doubt people reference Greek mythology much when they're grieving, and that's true. Probably not, and they probably didn't then. Of course, remember the order of the story is that the narrator's reading this myth, and then he falls asleep and he has this dream. So the man in black himself, I guess, doesn't really verbalize the Sais and Alcyone myth. It's interesting to me that Chaucer, the author, is writing this based on a real person, on John of Gaunt and his wife Blanche. But so he's got his fictional narrator reading a myth, and then because of that myth, he has a dream. So the dream is several layers removed from reality because the narrator's not a real person. The story of Sais and Alcyone is not about real people, and so the dream this guy has based on it is sort of three removes from reality. But actually, that's the closest touchstone to historical reality that we have in the story is the man in black, because John of Gaunt was a man who wore black armor who lost his wife. So that's interesting. But Becca thinks that the chessboard metaphor is a good one. And yeah, you're right. Exactly what I was trying to say that you've said better here. The metaphor creating a distancing effect. So by thinking of it as a chess game, he is able to not deal with it, but perhaps as I said, maybe the narrator forcing him to take it out of the world of metaphor has made it so he can deal with it a little bit better or more immediately. I don't know if it's better or not. Good response from Callie. Good response from Sarah, of course. Good response from Julie. Yeah, a lot of people tend to talk nonsense as they work through their pain, and they don't think coherently enough to be philosophical. People react differently, but it seems to be kind of a stretch. There's a genre that Chaucer he writes in some, actually I guess you could say this poem is, but also that he translates, which is the consolatio, which is a Roman form, which is a verse, a poem, which is designed to help console somebody through either through a loss or a difficult time. One of the works Chaucer translated was Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which was a book Boethius wrote when he was imprisoned for being a Christian. And it sort of goes through things that you're meant to console yourself with when you're in a difficult time. So, right, we don't necessarily today pull out ancient myths, but in the tradition of the Consolatio, you might in fact see that. You might see somebody citing a well-known myth or story to help out. Oh, y'all should pause this and go get some water. I'm sure that I'm wearing you out, but stick with it. We're getting there. All right, so Julie's response we have here. And Julie brought up a really interesting thing, and I'd never thought of this, that the man in black is in black, right? And the queen is referred to as white in real life. She was Blanche, which is blanc, which is white. And in chess, right, the black knight and the white queen would be on opposite sides, working against each other. And Julie very cleverly puts it in terms of the romance as being one game of chess that he, quote, captures her by pursuing her for a year. And then, I don't know, does she then turn over to his side or something like that? And then we have this, really only the second game of chess is the one with fortune. And this is how he loses his queen. But I thought this was great. It never occurred to me that the black and white dichotomy would put them on opposite sides of the chessboard. And those words, black and white, are played up over and over again. So it's certainly no accident. It's nothing that would have escaped Chaucer. So, but I like your way of working through it, which is to make the initial courtship the game where they were, quote, opponents. They weren't really opponents, but they were working towards different things. And then the loss of her in the game with fortune is a different one. So I like that a lot. The story of Sais and Alcyone. Now you said she doesn't hesitate to go into the sea to drown herself. Was that what happened, or did she just sort of die of a broken heart and was buried at sea? I can't recall. But your point is well taken, which is that the knight never is suicidal, and in fact, he doesn't even say, "I wish I could die." He doesn't have that. He is despondent. He lacks purpose. He is in sort of a dark place, but you have the feeling that maybe it's not an inescapable place. That he is, if not moving forward, maybe in a place where he will be able to move forward eventually. But yeah, that's a really good point that you make. That the knight doesn't seem to have. He's not comparable to Alcyone in the sense that he's not suicidal. Julie has a good disclaimer here about courtly love. Right, all men and women don't necessarily think this way, and I think getting back to what I said a minute ago, I mean, what I remember from ancient times when I dated, when dinosaurs walked the earth, is that, right, there's some women who absolutely, that's a standard. They would expect it. They would count points off if you didn't behave in a chivalric way. And there are women who might feel as though, well, are you implying that I can't pay for my own meal, that I can't open my own doors? Um, and I mean, I think people of goodwill and common sense can work these things out pretty easily. But right, we're not implying that all women or men think this way. But to generalize, right, women want to be rescued by a knight in shining armor, and men want to do the rescuing. It goes both ways, right? It's not just that women are taught that they ought to be rescued, um, but that men are taught that they ought to rescue. And this is when you get into different conversation styles between men and women, which I had to learn the hard way in my relationships and marriage, which is that when a woman tells a man, "Oh, I'm having this problem and that problem," the tendency of the man can be, "Oh, well, let me help you fix that." And sometimes what's needed is a listener more than a fixer. And but I think it does go back to this paradigm of rescuing and rescued. One of the things that we've seen in the past few years in that greatest and most influential of cultural institutions, which is the Disney movie, is they're at least now making an effort to have some princesses who, yes, they have to be princesses, but that are exhibiting some independence, whose entire life is not vested upon the right man coming along. And I think this is a step forward. But in general, right, this is the chivalric myth that a woman needs to be rescued. We think it's chivalrous when a man opens a door for a woman or pulls her chair out before she sits down. And again, can a woman not open her own door? Well, of course she can. But these hark back to a time when women were wearing clothes, for example, that were not um, particularly easy to move around in. That you're walking streets that had lots of mud and filth in them. So a lot of these rules go back to a time where there was a practical element to it. Number six, men like the chase and they want a pure virginal character who appears weak, a man who puts her high on a pedestal. Right, and this, of course, is going to, we'll discuss this often in here, but this sort of paradigm of women for the Middle Ages, but it's survived a little bit into the 21st century even, which is that women either can be virtuous, pure, chaste, like the Virgin Mary, or they are evil, deceitful, lustful, like Eve. And Mary and Eve were very much the two examples of womanhood that the church propounded as you can be this or you can be that, but leaving very little room for someone who is somewhere in between, who is, a person with feelings and desires and romantic and physical wants and needs, but also someone who is morally and intellectually the equal of any man. So, yeah, we still have this to some degree. Talk to any high school boy, unfortunately, and he'll probably tell you something similar. D, I believe both men and women would want to feel their significant other loves them so much that the other one would just die, and I think that's true. I don't think it's reasonable, but I think it's true that part of you hopes that they would just have a broken heart. And you read these things of a couple that's been married for 50 years and they die within 12 hours of each other, on the same day. And I think there's something to that. But I think one of the things that Chaucer's getting at with his poem is even if you feel like you're going to die, um, most of the time you don't. Most of the time you live through it. Number four, crazy things that point to a dream. And right, you've just listed some dreamlike things that don't make logical sense, that wouldn't make sense in the waking world, but work in the dream world. And Julie's written that this seems typical of the grieving process. And right, you're the first one to sort of mention the stages of grief: anger, bargaining, um, depression, and possibly at the end, acceptance, because he gets up from under the tree and he moves. He just in some ways, just to get yourself off the ground and move your body is the first step to going through a grieving process. So I thought that was really astute of you. And Susanna too just points out the black and white thing, which I think that was really, really smart. I didn't think of that at all. And coming back up here, I think we have still got Susanna's response, which we do. And great. So Susanna, the role of chess in the poem. First is a game the narrator chooses not to play, choosing to read instead. And yeah, I had completely forgotten about that. That when the narrator's trying to go to sleep, and he's apparently has servants. He seems to be wealthy because people offer him books. They offer him, but one of the things that he chooses not to do is to play at tables. I think is what it says, which means to play chess. So I think that was really so. Yeah, what do you want to do with that? I mean, does that mean that the narrator is not a participant in the game of life? Is he not a participant in the game of love? And I say that not only just from this evidence, but in both the House of Fame and the Parliament of Fowls, you're going to see that the narrator, who maybe he's the same narrator and maybe he's not, is spoken of as never having success in love. That he has kind of stayed on the sidelines in the game of love. So I think that that's really smart that you point out that the narrator has turned down a game of chess early on. Right, and the rest is these are all things that I think most people have sort of seen and pointed out. It is, again, the story of Sais and Alcyone is in some ways a match to the Man in Black story, but in some puzzling ways it isn't at all. Number 3, women are still expected to be beautiful. Yes, I expect all women to be beautiful. But yeah, no, society does sort of put that out there, and you would think we would have moved along, but we've not. Virtues would include some of those found in the poem. Perhaps Lady doesn't hurt people's feelings, or is kind, generous, and forgiving. They're all valued. And that's true. I mean, even though we might, if we're reading a romance novel or something like that, we might see a woman's physical attributes listed and cataloged, but not her moral ones. But there is still an expectation. I mean, you're still supposed to be, quote, a great girl. You're still supposed to be, yeah, as you say, kind, generous, forgiving, which I think is a virtue that is emphasized a lot with modern women, because I think that virtues maybe are not emphasized so much with modern men. So the women have to be forgiving more than the men have to behave. Number 4, what are some of the things that indicate that this is a dream? Yeah, Susanna points out that this is the Troy story that's annealed on the glass of the stained glass window here. And that's going to be really important. The Troy story is the most non-biblical, most important non-biblical story in the Middle Ages. It's alluded to constantly, all the time. Chaucer's going to do it. All medieval authors did it. If you need a refresher, you should probably go back and look up a real brief plot summary of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and maybe even the Aeneid, just to kind of remind yourself. But right, Troy was this city that was put under siege because Helen ran away from her husband and joined Paris, the Prince of Troy, and the Greeks, including Achilles, laid siege to Troy, and Aeneas and others escaped after the Trojan horse and went on to found Rome. So, yeah, this is a story that Chaucer's audience would have been extremely well versed in. They would know all the details, and they would find it to be a fitting thing that you would memorialize in a stained glass window. Right, and Susanna goes on to list some of the other things. Yeah, I like the puppy is my favorite part. You just sort of follow, hey, well, it's a puppy. He's got such a low attention span. He just takes off after this puppy, and then when he sees the Man in Black, we never hear the puppy. I don't know what happened to the puppy. I don't know if he turned into the Man in Black, if he went back home, if he disappeared in a puff of smoke. But like, it's a puppy. Aw, everybody loves puppies. So finally, yeah, and Susanna points out some of these stages of grief. I guess it was Kubler-Ross who originally sort of came up with these, but anger, regret, guilt, sorrow, blaming, and then finally acceptance. The difference here is that perhaps he places the blame on the supernatural realm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, he places it on fortune, so he's not really putting it at the feet of God, per se, but he is treating fortune almost as if she is a goddess or she has goddess like powers, or certainly supernatural ones, which is what you're saying here. Most people today would likely place this blame on doctors, friends, family, or self. Right? We don't, or God. I mean, people get angry at God with it, understandably so, at times that seem to be inexplicable. Um, but right, we don't sort of personify luck, bad luck got him. That's the last thing we want to say is it was just bad luck because that seems very purposeless to us. To the man in black, though, it seemed to make sense because he puts Fortuna as this sort of active force in the universe. Okay, so these were great. These were terrific responses. This is exactly what I'm looking for from you all. Um, let me know. Email me or post on the discussion board. I'll continue to check this thread and let me know what you think about this. The screencast is a way of responding. As I say, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have typed as much as I just said, and maybe I don't know. That might have been a blessing if I had chosen to do that. But I'm comfortable with this. But what I want to do is what's comfortable to all of you. So let me know if you like this, or if you would prefer some typing instead of talking, or if you have some third magical method of responding to discussion. So thank you for your attention to all this, and I'll be communicating with you soon.